Commander Zek-Hai stood motionless in the observation deck of the Galactic Council's flagship, his four eyes fixed on the blue marble spinning slowly in the void below. Earth, the third planet from a modest yellow star, home to the species that had just shattered every assumption the galaxy held about warfare, endurance, and what it meant to survive. The Kytherian warrior's chitinous exoskeleton bore the deep scars of countless battles across 7 different star systems. Each mark told a story of victory, of enemies fallen before his plasma rifle, and tactical brilliance. For 2 centuries, he had been the Council's premier military strategist, the being other species called when they needed impossible victories against overwhelming odds. His reputation preceded him into every conflict zone, and his mere presence was often enough to secure surrender without firing a shot. But now, staring at this unremarkable world, Zek-Hai felt something he had never experienced in all his years of combat. Uncertainty. Not fear, exactly, but a profound unsettling that reached deep into his core. The humans had done something that defied every military doctrine, every understanding of sustainable warfare that the galaxy had developed over millennia of conflict. The Drakmari invasion had lasted 7 years. 7 years of brutal, relentless warfare that should have broken any civilized species within months. The Drakmari Empire, a coalition of 12 different alien races united under a philosophy of total conquest, had swept through 3 sectors of space like a plague. Their strategy was simple, but devastatingly effective. Overwhelm, occupy, and systematically break the will of any species that dared resist. Zek-Hai had studied their campaigns extensively. The Kree homeworld had fallen in 18 standard days. The proud Vorthan Confederacy, with their legendary defensive capabilities, had managed to hold out for 6 months before their leaders sued for peace. The Drakmari method was psychological as much as physical. They would siege a world, cutting off all supply lines and communications, then begin a campaign of calculated terror designed to destroy hope itself. They had deployed this same strategy against Earth, expecting similar results. The initial siege had been textbook Drakmari doctrine. They established a blockade with over 3,000 vessels, cutting the humans off from any potential allies. They bombarded military installations from orbit, crippling the human space fleet in the first week. They landed ground forces on every continent simultaneously, targeting population centers and infrastructure with surgical precision. By all galactic standards, the war should have ended within the first year. The humans were a young species, barely 3 centuries into their space age. Their technology was primitive compared to the Drakmari arsenal. Their military was small, their weapons outdated, their defensive systems laughably inadequate by galactic standards. Intelligence reports had suggested they would surrender within months, perhaps weeks. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The humans adapted. Zek-Hai pulled up the holographic reports on his personal datapad, files he had read hundreds of times in the past weeks since arriving in the Sol system. The first year of the invasion had proceeded exactly as the Drakmari had planned. Human military resistance had been crushed, their governments toppled, their major cities occupied. But instead of surrender, something else emerged from the ashes of conventional warfare. The humans began fighting in ways that violated every established rule of civilized conflict. When their armies were destroyed, they formed smaller units. When those were eliminated, they went underground. Literally underground. They carved out vast tunnel networks beneath their cities, turning the very earth into a weapon against their occupiers. They studied their enemies with a focus that bordered on obsession, learning to identify Drakmari weak points, communication patterns, supply routes. But what disturbed Zek-Hai most was not their tactical adaptation, but their psychological resilience. The Drakmari had perfected techniques of demoralization that had broken the spirit of dozens of species. They would capture human settlements, execute leaders publicly, destroy cultural monuments, separate families. Standard procedure that had never failed to eventually produce surrender negotiations. The humans had responded by becoming even more determined. Zek-Hai's datapad chirped softly, drawing his attention back to the present. A message from Admiral Thessera of the Galactic Council's peacekeeping force. Commander, the human delegation is ready for your interview. They're waiting in Conference Chamber 7. He closed the datapad and turned away from the viewport, his movements deliberate and controlled. This was why he was here, really. The Council needed to understand what had happened during those 7 years. How had a primitive species not only survived, but ultimately repelled an invasion that should have been impossible to resist? The military implications were staggering. If humans could endure what the Drachmari had subjected them to, it suggested that every previous assumption about warfare and resistance was fundamentally flawed. The corridors of the Council ship were designed to accommodate dozens of different species, with variable gravity fields and atmospheric controls that adjusted automatically as beings moved through different sections. Zekai's heavy footsteps echoed against the metallic floors as he made his way toward the conference chambers, passing clusters of diplomats and military observers from across the galaxy. Many stopped their conversations to watch him pass. Everyone knew why he was here. Conference Chamber 7 was a neutral environment, designed to put all species at ease during delicate negotiations. The lighting was soft but adequate, the temperature controlled to a comfortable median, the furnishings adjustable to accommodate different physiologies. As Zekai entered, he was struck immediately by the presence of the three humans waiting for him. They sat quietly at the oval table, their posture relaxed but alert. 2 males and 1 female, all appearing to be in their middle years by human standards. They wore simple civilian clothing, nothing that indicated military rank or governmental authority. But there was something in their eyes, a quality that Zekai recognized from his own reflection after particularly brutal campaigns. These were beings who had seen the very worst that war could offer and had somehow emerged intact. Commander Zekai. The female human spoke first, rising from her chair. I'm Sarah Chun, formerly of the North American Resistance Network. These are my colleagues Marcus Webb from the European Underground and Dmitry Volkov from the Siberian Defense Coalition. Zekai activated his universal translator and responded with the formal greeting protocol. I am honored by your presence. The Galactic Council has asked me to conduct this interview to better understand the events of the recent conflict. Your cooperation is appreciated. Sarah Chun smiled, an expression that among humans could convey anything from joy to challenge. In this case, Zekai suspected it was neither. We understand you want to know how we survived, how we won. The records indicate that the Drachmari campaign against your world followed standard invasion protocols. Zekai began, settling into a chair designed to accommodate his larger frame. Initial orbital bombardment, systematic destruction of military assets, occupation of major population centers, implementation of psychological warfare techniques. These methods have proven effective against 47 different species over the past 2 centuries. Yet somehow, you not only resisted but ultimately forced a complete Drachmari withdrawal. Marcus Webb leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. Commander, may I ask about your own military experience? Have you ever been in a war that lasted longer than 2 years? The question caught Zekai off guard. The longest campaign in my experience was the Sector 9 Rebellion, which lasted 14 months. Most conflicts are resolved within 6 to 8 months once proper pressure is applied. 14 months, Dmitry Volkov repeated, his accent thick even through the translator. We fought for 7 years, not 14 months. 7 years of watching our world burn, our people die, our children grow up in tunnels and bunkers and ruins. Do you understand what that means, Commander? Zekai's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. I understand that it represents an unprecedented length of resistance. What I hope to understand is how such resistance was sustained. The psychological profiles we have of your species suggest that humans require social stability, regular nutrition, and security to maintain optimal mental function. The Drachmari systematically attacked all of these requirements. Sarah Chin's smile faded. They did. They attacked everything that made us human, everything that made life worth living. They killed our leaders, destroyed our cities, poisoned our water supplies, bombed our hospitals and schools. They hunted down anyone who showed signs of organizing resistance. They separated families, executed civilians, turned our own infrastructure against us. And yet you continued fighting, Zekai observed. We continued living, Marcus corrected. Fighting was just part of that. When they took our governments, we formed our own. When they destroyed our armies, we became our own soldiers. When they cut our supply lines, we learned to make everything we needed from scratch, in basements and caves and abandoned subway tunnels. Zekai accessed his datapad and pulled up specific reports from the conflict. According to Drachmari intelligence files captured after their withdrawal, human resistance actually increased during the 3rd and fourth years of occupation. This defies all established patterns of resistance warfare. Most species show a steady decline in fighting effectiveness after the first year of sustained pressure. Most species probably haven't had to deal with 7 billion individuals who decided they'd rather die than give up, Dmitri said quietly. You want to know our secret, Commander? We didn't have one. We just refused to quit. The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Zekhai found himself struggling to process its implications. He had expected to discover some revolutionary military technique, some advanced technology that had been hidden from Drachmary intelligence, some alliance with other species that had provided covert support. Instead, he was being told that human success had been based on nothing more than stubborn refusal to surrender. That cannot be the complete explanation, he insisted. The Drachmary employed psychological warfare techniques that have broken the resistance of species with far more advanced military technologies than your own. They understand how to systematically destroy hope, how to create conditions that make continued resistance seem futile. Sarachin stood and walked to the chamber's viewport, looking out at the stars. They understood how to break species that fought like civilized beings. Species that had rules, that tried to minimize casualties, that viewed war as a last resort to be ended as quickly as possible. They didn't understand how to fight beings who stopped caring about civilization and started caring only about survival and revenge. You are suggesting that humans abandoned civilized warfare? Zekhai asked. We abandoned everything that didn't help us kill Drachmary, Marcus said bluntly. Every comfort, every convention, every assumption about how wars are supposed to work. When they bombed our cities, we moved underground. When they poisoned our food supplies, we learned to eat things that would disgust other species. When they cut our communications, we developed signal systems using everything from reflected light to trained animals. When they captured our weapons, we made new ones from kitchen utensils and industrial chemicals. Zekhai felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. You transformed your entire species into a military force. No, Dmitri shook his head. We transformed our entire species into survivors. Every child learned to move silently through rubble. Every adult learned to identify Drachmary equipment by sound alone. Every elderly person became a repository of knowledge about improvised weapons and hidden supply caches. We didn't become soldiers. We became something else entirely. The Kytherian commander stared at the three humans, trying to reconcile their calm demeanor with the implications of what they were describing. In his experience, species that underwent such total militarization typically suffered complete social collapse within months. The psychological strain of transforming an entire civilization into a war machine was considered unsustainable by every military theorist in the galaxy. How did you maintain social cohesion during such extensive adaptation? He asked. Our models suggest that the level of transformation you're describing should have resulted in societal breakdown, internal conflict, loss of cultural identity. Sarah returned to the table, her expression thoughtful. It probably should have. We lost a lot of who we used to be, but we gained something else. We discovered that humans are capable of surviving in conditions that would destroy most other species, not because we're stronger or smarter, but because we're more stubborn. We simply refuse to accept that any situation is hopeless. The interview continued for several more hours, with Zekhai probing deeper into specific aspects of human resistance strategy. He learned about the tunnel networks that eventually connected entire continents, about the improvised manufacturing systems that produced weapons from scavenged materials, about the communication networks that operated using principles that most species would consider primitive but which proved nearly impossible for the Drachmary to intercept or jam. But what disturbed him most was not the technical details of human adaptation, but the psychological profile that emerged from their descriptions. These were beings who had systematically discarded every assumption about the limits of endurance, about the breaking point of civilized society, about the conditions necessary for continued resistance. As the formal interview concluded and the humans prepared to depart, Sarah Chun paused at the chamber door. Commander, may I ask you something? Zekhai nodded. In your experience, what's the longest any species has ever continued fighting after losing all hope of victory? The question struck him like a physical blow. Most species surrender when victory becomes impossible. Continued resistance beyond that point is considered irrational. Sarah smiled again, that same expression that conveyed something beyond simple human emotion. That's the difference, then. We never lost hope of victory, because we never accepted that victory was impossible. Even when our planet was burning, even when 90% of our infrastructure was destroyed, even when we were reduced to eating rats and fighting with sharpened sticks, we still believed we could win. After the humans left, Zekai remained alone in the conference chamber for a long time, staring at his notes and trying to process what he had learned. The implications were staggering. If humans could sustain resistance under conditions that would break any other known species, it suggested that every assumption about warfare, about the limits of endurance, about the breaking point of civilization, might be fundamentally wrong. More disturbing was the realization that the humans had not merely survived the Drachmarie invasion. They had thrived under conditions of total warfare, adapting and evolving in ways that transformed them into something unprecedented in galactic history. They had become a species for which surrender was literally inconceivable, for which continued resistance was not a choice, but a fundamental characteristic of their nature. As he made his way back to his quarters, Zekai found himself wondering whether the galaxy truly understood what it had just witnessed. The humans had not simply won a war. They had demonstrated that some species were capable of surviving and fighting under conditions that went beyond anything previously thought possible. And tomorrow, he would have to begin writing his report for the Galactic Council, trying to explain how everything they thought they knew about warfare had just been proven wrong. Zekai's sleep cycle had been disrupted for 3 standard days since his initial interview with the human delegation. The Kytherian commander found himself repeatedly accessing archived footage from the Drachmarie invasion, trying to reconcile what he had witnessed in the historical records with what the humans had told him. Each viewing session left him more unsettled than the last. This morning, he stood in his private quarters reviewing footage from the siege of New York, one of Earth's major population centers. The Drachmarie had followed their standard protocol: orbital bombardment of military installations, followed by ground forces establishing control points throughout the city. The humans had initially responded predictably, with organized military resistance that was quickly overwhelmed by superior Drachmarie technology and numbers. But then something changed. The footage showed the transformation happening in real time over several months. As organized resistance collapsed, something else began to emerge from the ruins. Small groups of humans started appearing in unexpected locations, using weapons that intelligence databases couldn't identify, employing tactics that violated every conventional understanding of urban warfare. Zekai paused the recording at a particular scene that had captured his attention during previous viewings. A group of human children, none appearing older than 12 standard years, were systematically dismantling a Drachmarie supply depot using nothing but improvised explosive devices and what appear to be kitchen utensils modified into weapons. The efficiency of their operation was remarkable, but what disturbed him was their absolute calm under pressure. These juveniles were conducting military operations with the composure of seasoned veterans. His door chimed, indicating a visitor. Admiral Thesera entered without waiting for permission, her angular Valerian features tense with concern. "Commander, the Council has received your preliminary report. There are questions." Zekai gestured for her to be seated, though he remained standing. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests Council members are having difficulty accepting your conclusions." Thesera activated her own datapad and began reading. Quote, "The committee finds it difficult to accept that a primitive species could sustain effective resistance for 7 years without significant external support or advanced technology. Request additional investigation to identify the true source of human military capability." End quote. The Kytherian commander's mandibles clicked in frustration. They believe the humans are lying. They believe you're missing something. Something that would explain how a species with no significant military experience could outfight the Drachmarie Empire. Thesera leaned forward. "Zekai, I've read your preliminary findings. If what you're suggesting is accurate, it means that every military doctrine we've developed over the past millennium is fundamentally flawed." "Perhaps it is." Zekai turned back to his viewport, looking out at Earth. "Perhaps we've been so focused on fighting civilized wars that we've forgotten what uncivilized ones look like. The Council has authorized you to conduct a more detailed investigation. Full access to human archives, permission to interview military personnel from the Resistance, access to the underground facilities where humans conducted their operations." Thesera stood to leave, then paused. "Zekai, be careful down there." The reports suggest that some humans still haven't fully readjusted to peacetime conditions. 3 hours later, Zekai found himself in a transport shuttle descending toward Earth's surface. His destination was the North American eastern seaboard, specifically the tunnel networks beneath what had once been called Washington, D.C. Sarah Chun had agreed to guide him through the underground installations, but she had warned him that the experience might be more intense than he anticipated. The surface of Earth still bore extensive scars from the 7-Year War. Entire city blocks remained in ruins, twisted metal, and concrete monuments to the ferocity of the conflict. But what struck Zekai most was the activity he observed as their shuttle descended. Humans were everywhere, rebuilding with the same methodical intensity that they had apparently brought to their resistance efforts. They worked with an efficiency that seemed almost mechanical, transforming destruction back into functional infrastructure at a pace that defied conventional estimates. The shuttle landed at what appeared to be a construction site, but Zekai quickly realized it was actually an entrance to the underground network. Sarah Chun met him at the landing pad, dressed in work clothes and carrying equipment that looked like a combination of archaeological tools and military gear. "Welcome to Earth, Commander," she said, gesturing toward a large opening in the ground that was clearly artificial. "Are you ready to see how we lived for 7 years?" The descent into the tunnel system was unlike anything Zekai had experienced. The passages were not crude caves or emergency shelters, but sophisticated underground cities complete with living quarters, manufacturing facilities, hydroponic gardens, and command centers. The engineering required to construct such networks while under constant enemy bombardment should have been impossible. "How did you build all this while fighting a war?" he asked as they walked through a corridor lined with workshops where humans were still manufacturing equipment. "We built it because we were fighting a war," Sarah replied. "Every tunnel, every room, every system was designed to serve the resistance. When the Drachmarie bombed our surface manufacturing plants, we moved production underground. When they cut our power grids, we developed independent energy systems. When they contaminated our water supplies, we dug deeper wells and built purification systems." They paused at a large chamber that appeared to be a command center, with displays showing real-time information about reconstruction efforts across the planet. But Zekai could see evidence that the same space had recently served a very different purpose. Weapon racks lined the walls, though they now held construction tools instead of combat equipment. Communication arrays that had obviously been designed for military coordination were now being used to coordinate civilian reconstruction. "This was the primary resistance coordination center for the Eastern Seaboard," Sarah explained. "During the war, this room coordinated operations for approximately 50 million humans across a territory spanning 2,000 kilometers. Zekai studied the displays, trying to understand the scale of what he was seeing. 50 million humans? Operating as a coordinated resistance force. 50 million in this sector alone. Similar networks existed under every major population center on the planet. The Drachmarie never understood that they weren't fighting armies. They were fighting entire populations that had decided to become armies. They continued deeper into the complex, passing through living quarters that showed signs of long-term habitation, workshops where humans had clearly been manufacturing weapons and equipment for years, and storage areas that still contained supplies produced during the conflict. What disturbed Zekai most was how normal it all seemed to the humans they encountered. Workers moved through the tunnels with casual familiarity, as if living underground for extended periods was a perfectly natural state of existence. "How many humans died during the 7 years?" Zekai asked as they entered what appeared to be a memorial chamber, with walls covered in names. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "We estimate between 800 million and 1 billion casualties. Almost 1 in 7 humans who were alive when the invasion began." The number hit Zekai like a physical blow. 1 billion casualties? "And your species continued fighting." "We continued living," Sarah corrected, using the same phrase she had used during their initial interview. The dead were mourned, but they were also motivations. Every name on these walls represented someone who had died for the principle that humans would not be conquered. Giving up would have dishonored their sacrifice. They spent the next several hours exploring different sections of the underground complex. Zekai saw hospitals where human medical personnel had developed treatment techniques for injuries that conventional medicine had never encountered. He saw schools where human children had been educated in subjects ranging from basic literacy to advanced explosive manufacturing. He saw workshops where humans had reverse-engineered captured Drachmarie technology and improved upon it using principles that the original designers had never considered. But what disturbed him most was the evidence of how completely human society had transformed during the conflict. These were not temporary wartime adaptations, but fundamental changes to how an entire species lived, worked, and thought. The humans had not simply endured 7 years of war. They had evolved into something entirely different from what they had been before the invasion. "Sarah," he said as they paused in a workshop where humans were converting former weapons manufacturing equipment to peaceful purposes, "how many of her people have actually readjusted to peacetime conditions?" She looked around the workshop, where former resistance fighters were methodically dismantling equipment they had spent years perfecting. "That's a complicated question, Commander. What does readjusted mean? We're not fighting anymore, if that's what you're asking. But we're also not the same species we were before the war." "We can't be." "What do you mean?" "Before the invasion, humans lived relatively comfortable lives. We had conflicts, certainly, but nothing that required entire populations to transform themselves into survival machines. Most humans never had to seriously consider what they would do if their entire civilization was threatened with extinction. The war forced every one of us to answer that question." They were joined by Marcus Webb, who had been working in another section of the complex. He looked tired, but there was an alertness in his eyes that Zekai had noticed in all the humans he had encountered. It was the look of beings who had learned to constantly assess their environment for threats and opportunities. "Commander," Marcus said, "Sarah mentioned that you wanted to understand how we sustained resistance for 7 years. Have you considered that you might be asking the wrong question?" Zekai's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "What would be the correct question? How do we sustain hope for 7 years? Anyone can fight for a few months if they have enough anger and desperation. But 7 years of effective resistance requires something more fundamental. It requires absolute certainty that victory is possible, regardless of how impossible it appears." And where did that certainty come from? Marcus gestured around the workshop, where humans were methodically converting weapons into tools. "From the same place it comes from now. We looked at what the Drachmarie had done to us, what they were continuing to do to us, and we decided that accepting defeat was literally unthinkable. Not difficult, not painful, not inadvisable. Unthinkable." Dmitry Volkov appeared from another section of the complex, carrying equipment that Zekai couldn't identify. "Commander, I understand you're trying to write a report that explains how we won. May I make a suggestion?" "Of course. Don't focus on how we won. Focus on why we couldn't lose. The Drachmarie made a fundamental error in their assessment of our species. They assumed that humans would respond to systematic pressure the same way other species had responded. They assumed that if they made continued resistance painful enough, we would eventually choose surrender as the less painful option. That is standard psychological warfare doctrine," Zekai observed. "It has proven effective against dozens of species, because those species were capable of viewing surrender as an acceptable outcome under certain conditions. Humans are not." Dmitry set down his equipment and looked directly at Zekai. "Commander, let me ask you something. In your military experience, have you ever encountered a species that was literally incapable of surrendering?" The question caught Zekai off guard. All species are capable of surrendering when the alternatives become sufficiently unpleasant. That's what the Drachmarie thought. They spent 7 years trying to make continued resistance more unpleasant than surrender. They never understood that for humans, surrender itself was more unpleasant than any consequence of continued resistance. They were trying to break a species that was psychologically incapable of being broken. As the day continued, Zekai interviewed dozens of humans who had participated in the resistance. Farmers who had learned to grow food in hidden underground gardens while simultaneously manufacturing explosives. Teachers who had educated children in academic subjects while training them in guerrilla warfare tactics. Engineers who had designed increasingly sophisticated weapons while maintaining the infrastructure necessary to sustain millions of people in underground cities. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of a species that had undergone a transformation so complete that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. The humans had not simply fought a war, they had become a war. Every aspect of their society had been reorganized around the principle of continued resistance, and they had sustained this transformation for 7 years without any significant breakdown in social cohesion. But Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that this transformation had not been temporary. The humans were rebuilding their civilization, but they were not returning to what they had been before the invasion. They were creating something new, something that incorporated the lessons they had learned about their own capabilities during 7 years of total warfare. As evening approached, and Zekai prepared to return to the council ship, Sarah-chan walked with him back to the surface. The ruins of the former city were visible in all directions, but so was the evidence of rebuilding. Humans worked continuously, their efforts coordinated with the same precision that had characterized their resistance operations. "Commander," Sarah said as they reached the shuttle landing pad, "what will you tell the council about us?" Zekai considered the question carefully. "I will tell them that your species represents something unprecedented in galactic history. You have demonstrated capabilities that challenge every assumption we have made about warfare, about endurance, about the limits of what civilized beings can survive. And do you think they'll believe you?" "I think they'll have to, because the alternative is to accept that everything they think they know about military science is wrong." Zekai paused at the shuttle entrance. "Sarah, may I ask you one final question?" "Of course. If another species attempted to invade Earth today, how do you think humans would respond?" Sarah's smile was the same expression he had seen before, but now Zekai understood what it conveyed. It was not joy or challenge, but absolute certainty. "We would do exactly what we did before, Commander. We would refuse to lose, no matter what it cost us." As the shuttle lifted off and Earth fell away below them, Zekai found himself contemplating the implications of what he had witnessed. The humans had not simply survived the Drakmari invasion. They had discovered something about themselves that changed their fundamental nature as a species. They had learned that they were capable of enduring and fighting under conditions that would destroy other civilizations, and that knowledge had become part of their collective identity. The report he would write for the Galactic Council would be unlike any military analysis in galactic history, because he was not simply describing a military victory. He was describing the emergence of a species that had transcended conventional limitations on endurance, adaptability, and determination. The humans had become something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species for whom surrender was not merely inadvisable or painful, but literally impossible. And Zekai was beginning to suspect that the galaxy was not prepared for the implications of that transformation. The next phase of Zekai's investigation took him to the former Drakmari Command Center on Luna, Earth's natural satellite. The facility had been captured during the final year of the war and now served as a joint Human Galactic Council research station. What the Kytherian commander discovered there would fundamentally alter his understanding of not just the human victory, but the nature of the Drakmari defeat. Admiral Thresh of the Drakmari Imperial Navy sat across from Zekai in what had once been his own strategic planning chamber. The proud warrior's scales had lost their lustrous sheen, and his movements carried the weight of someone who had experienced something beyond simple military defeat. This was a being who had been broken by forces he still didn't fully comprehend. "Commander Zekai," Thresh began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of military protocol despite his circumstances, "I understand you wish to discuss the events of the Sol campaign." Zekai activated his recording equipment and settled into the interrogation pose that had served him well during countless debriefings. "Admiral, your forces employed standard Drakmari invasion protocols against Earth. These same protocols have resulted in successful conquest of 47 different worlds. Yet the Sol campaign ended in complete Drakmari withdrawal. I need to understand what went wrong from your perspective." Thresh was silent for nearly a full minute, his reptilian eyes fixed on something beyond the chamber walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an undertone that Zekai had never heard from a Drakmari officer before: uncertainty. "Nothing went wrong, Commander. That is what you must understand. We executed our invasion protocols flawlessly. Every phase of the campaign proceeded exactly according to established doctrine. We achieved all primary objectives within the projected timeframes. We controlled all major population centers, eliminated organized military resistance, and implemented comprehensive psychological warfare protocols. And yet you ultimately withdrew all forces from a system. We withdrew because we realized we were not fighting a war. We were fighting something else entirely." Thresh activated a holographic display that showed the Sol system during various phases of the invasion. "May I walk you through the campaign timeline?" Zekai gestured for him to proceed. Phase 1, Orbital Superiority and Infrastructure Destruction, completed in 6 standard days. Human space-based defenses were eliminated, planetary communication networks were severed, and all major military installations were reduced to non-functional status. By every metric we use to evaluate invasion success, Earth should have surrendered within the first month. The display showed the systematic destruction of human space stations, the precise bombardment of military targets, the establishment of Drachmary control over all approaches to the planet. It was a textbook example of overwhelming technological superiority applied with tactical precision. Phase 2, Ground Invasion and Occupation of Key Strategic Points, completed in 3 weeks. All major population centers were secured, human governmental structures were eliminated, and Drachmary administrative control was established over approximately 70% of the planet's habitable surface. Zekai studied the tactical displays, noting the efficiency with which Drachmary forces had established control. At this point, you must have been confident of imminent human surrender. Fresh's laugh was bitter. We were. The human government had been destroyed, their military was scattered, their infrastructure was in ruins. According to every precedent in our invasion database, formal surrender should have occurred within days. Instead, something unprecedented happened, which was the humans stopped being a civilization and became something else. They dispersed into small groups, abandoned their fixed installations, and began operating according to principles that our strategic databases had no protocols for addressing. Thresh manipulated the display to show activity patterns across Earth during the 2nd and 3rd months of the invasion. Look at this data, Commander. Does this resemble any military resistance you've ever encountered? The display showed what appeared to be random activity scattered across the entire planet. Small groups of humans appeared and disappeared without apparent coordination, striking at Drachmary positions in ways that suggested no central command structure. But as Zekai studied the patterns more carefully, he began to recognize an underlying organization that was unlike anything in his experience. They weren't fighting according to military doctrine, he observed. They weren't fighting according to any doctrine. They were operating like a natural phenomenon, like a plague or an environmental hazard that we had to constantly adapt to rather than an enemy that we could defeat through conventional military pressure. Thresh advanced the timeline to show events during the first year of occupation. The scattered human activity had not diminished as expected, but had instead grown more complex and effective. Attacks on Drachmary positions increased in frequency and sophistication, while the attackers themselves became increasingly difficult to locate and engage. By the end of the first year, we realized that we were not fighting an army that could be defeated. We were fighting an entire species that had decided to become an army. Every human civilian was a potential combatant. Every human settlement was a potential military target. Every human interaction was a potential intelligence operation. How did your forces respond to this realization? Fresh's expression grew darker. We implemented intensified psychological warfare protocols. Public executions, destruction of cultural sites, separation of family units, systematic destruction of food production facilities. These measures have never failed to break resistance within months. And the human response? They became more determined. Not just more resistant, Commander. More determined. As if our psychological warfare was actually strengthening their resolve rather than weakening it. Thresh manipulated the display to show casualty figures from the 2nd and 3rd years of the campaign. We were killing humans at a rate of approximately 2 million per month. By conventional analysis, such losses should have resulted in complete social collapse within a year. Zekai studied the data, noting that human resistance activity had actually increased during the periods of highest casualties. The humans were fighting more effectively as they suffered greater losses. They were evolving. Every month, they became better at fighting us. They learned our equipment, our tactics, our weaknesses. They developed countermeasures for every weapon we deployed, workarounds for every strategy we implemented. And they did all of this while sustaining casualties that should have destroyed their capacity for organized resistance. The holographic display shifted to show intelligence reports from the 4th and 5th years of the campaign. Zekai was astonished by what he saw. The scattered, apparently random human activity had organized itself into sophisticated networks that spanned entire continents. Manufacturing centers hidden underground were producing weapons that incorporated captured Drachmary technology. Communication systems were operating using principles that Drachmary intelligence had been unable to intercept or decode. How long did it take your forces to realize that the humans were winning? Zekai asked. Thresh was quiet for another long moment. We never realized it, Commander. Even at the end, we believed that victory was still possible if we could just apply enough pressure. It was only after the withdrawal that we understood what had actually happened, which was, we had spent 7 years trying to break a species that was psychologically incapable of being broken. Every action we took to demoralize them instead taught them new ways to fight us. Every casualty we inflicted motivated them to become more effective at inflicting casualties on us. Every month of occupation made them better at resisting occupation. Thresh advanced the timeline to show the final 2 years of the campaign. The data was remarkable. Human resistance networks had evolved to the point where they were conducting coordinated planetary operations. Supply lines that spanned multiple continents delivered resources to resistance cells that had become indistinguishable from professional military units. Manufacturing capabilities that had been completely destroyed at the beginning of the war had been rebuilt underground and were producing weapons that were, in many cases, superior to standard Drachmary equipment. In the 6th year, we began to realize that we were losing more equipment and personnel than we were destroying. The humans were not simply resisting our invasion. They were actively reversing it. Our supply lines were under constant attack. Our positions were being systematically isolated and eliminated, and our personnel were suffering from psychological breakdown due to the stress of fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. What was the final factor that led to withdrawal? Thresh closed the holographic display and looked directly at Zekai. We realized that the humans were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to win, and they were winning. After 7 years of total warfare, they had not only survived everything we could do to them, but they had become stronger, more organized, and more effective than they had been at the beginning of the invasion. The interview continued for several more hours, with Thresh providing detailed analysis of specific battles, strategic decisions, and intelligence assessment from throughout the campaign. What emerged was a picture of a military organization that had systematically failed to understand what it was fighting against. The Drachmary had approached the invasion of Earth using doctrines developed for fighting conventional civilizations with conventional military structures and conventional psychological limitations. They had never encountered a species that could transform itself so completely under pressure, that could sustain effective resistance while suffering casualties that would have destroyed any other civilization, that could actually become more effective as the conflict became more brutal. Commander, Thresh said as the interview concluded, may I offer you some advice about the humans? Please, do not make the mistake of believing that their victory was based on superior technology or strategic brilliance. It was based on something far more dangerous, the absolute refusal to accept that defeat was possible. They sustained 7 years of total warfare, not because they were confident of victory, but because they were incapable of conceiving of surrender. After leaving the former Drachmary commander, Zekai spent the remainder of the day reviewing captured Drachmary intelligence files. The documents provided a detailed record of how the invasion had been planned, implemented, and ultimately abandoned. What disturbed him most was how reasonable all the Drachmary decisions appeared in hindsight. Their strategic assessments had been accurate, their tactical implementations had been flawless, and their psychological warfare protocols had been applied exactly as designed. The problem was not that the Drachmary had made errors. The problem was that all their protocols had been developed for fighting species that operated within certain psychological and organizational parameters. The humans had simply abandoned those parameters entirely. Late in the evening, Zekai received a communication from Sarah Chun, who was still coordinating reconstruction efforts on Earth. She had offered to provide him with access to human strategic planning documents from the Resistance period, materials that might help him understand how the humans had organized their 7-year campaign. The documents, when he reviewed them, were unlike any military planning materials he had ever encountered. Instead of conventional strategic analyses focused on achieving specific tactical objectives, human planning documents were organized around a single principle: how to sustain resistance indefinitely regardless of casualties or setbacks. Human strategic planning had not focused on winning the war in any conventional sense. It had focused on creating conditions under which the war could continue until the Drachmari decided that victory was impossible. The humans had never planned to defeat the Drachmari in direct military confrontation. They had planned to make conquest so difficult and so costly that the Drachmari would eventually abandon the attempt. But what was most remarkable about the human strategic documents was their complete absence of any contingency planning for surrender. There were detailed protocols for evacuating populations, for establishing new resistance cells when existing ones were destroyed, for maintaining manufacturing and communication capabilities under extreme conditions. But there were no documents that addressed what humans should do if their resistance became unsustainable, because the humans had never considered that possibility. HFY spent the night reviewing battle reports, casualty figures, and strategic assessments from both human and Drachmari sources. What emerged was a picture of a conflict that had evolved far beyond anything in recorded galactic history. The Drachmari had fought a conventional invasion against a species that had responded by abandoning conventional civilization. The humans had fought a survival war against an enemy that had never understood that some species were willing to sacrifice everything to avoid surrender. The next morning, he received a priority communication from the Galactic Council. His preliminary reports had been reviewed by the Committee on Military Affairs, and there were serious concerns about his conclusions. The committee was requesting additional evidence to support his assessment that human victory had been based on psychological factors rather than technological or strategic advantages. As HFY prepared his response to the Council's inquiry, he realized that he was facing the same problem that had confronted the Drachmari throughout their 7-year campaign. The galactic community, like the Drachmari Empire, operated according to certain assumptions about warfare, about the limits of endurance, about the conditions under which civilized species would surrender. The humans had proven that those assumptions were wrong. They had demonstrated that some species were capable of sustaining resistance under conditions that would destroy any other civilization. And they had done so not through superior technology or brilliant strategy, but through the simple refusal to accept that surrender was an option. Now HFY had to convince the Galactic Council that everything they thought they knew about military science was fundamentally flawed, because the alternative was to accept that the humans represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had transcended the conventional limitations of warfare itself. And based on his conversations with both the humans and their former enemies, HFY was beginning to suspect that the galaxy was not prepared for the implications of that discovery. The emergency session of the Galactic Council's Committee on Military Affairs convened in a high-security chambers aboard the flagship Astros Ventus. Representatives from 43 different species filled the curved amphitheater, their attention focused on the central podium where HFY stood preparing to deliver what he knew would be the most controversial military assessment in galactic history. Council Chairman Veltar of the Zephyrian Collective called the session to order with the traditional ceremonial gestures, but HFY could sense the tension radiating from the assembled delegates. His preliminary reports had already circulated through the galactic intelligence community, and the implications had caused significant alarm among military strategists across known space. Commander HFY, Chairman Veltar began, his translated voice carrying the formal cadence of official council proceedings. You have submitted preliminary findings regarding the recent conflict between the Drachmari Empire and the human species of Sol 3. These findings have raised concerns among the committee members. Please present your complete analysis. HFY activated the holographic display system and began with what he knew would be the most palatable part of his assessment, the conventional military analysis of the conflict. The display showed the Sol system, with tactical overlays indicating Drachmari force deployments, strategic objectives, and timeline projections. Honored delegates, the Drachmari invasion of the Sol system proceeded according to established Imperial doctrine. Phase 1 objectives were achieved within 6 standard days, Phase 2 objectives within 3 weeks, and Phase 3 psychological warfare protocols were implemented according to schedule. The display showed the systematic destruction of human space-based defenses, the occupation of major population centers, and the implementation of control systems that had proven effective on dozens of other worlds. By all conventional metrics, the invasion should have concluded with human surrender within the first year. Instead, we observed an unprecedented transformation in human resistance patterns that ultimately resulted in complete Drachmary withdrawal after 7 years of occupation. Delegate Crixhan of the Mantari Defense Guild interrupted with a clicking sound that is translator rendered as skepticism. Commander, our intelligence services have reviewed the same data. While the length of human resistance was unusual, it seems likely that they received covert support from other species or possessed advanced technology that Drachmary intelligence failed to detect. Zekai had expected this challenge. Delegate Crixhan, I have personally interviewed both human resistance leaders and captured Drachmary commanders. I have examined the underground facilities where humans conducted their operations, reviewed their manufacturing capabilities, and analyzed their communication systems. I can state with absolute certainty that human resistance was conducted without external support and using technology that was, by galactic standards, primitive. The murmur of conversation that rippled through the chamber carried undertones of disbelief. Delegate Duran of the Cosmic Commerce Federation leaned forward in her seat. Then, how do you explain their victory, Commander? That question requires me to address the fundamental premise of your inquiry. Zekai changed the holographic display to show casualty figures and resistance activity levels throughout the 7-year conflict. The humans did not achieve victory through superior military capability. They achieved victory by demonstrating that they were psychologically incapable of accepting defeat. The chamber fell silent. Chairman Veltar's mandibles moved in the Zephyrian equivalent of confusion. Please clarify that statement, Commander. The humans sustained effective military resistance for 7 years, while suffering approximately 1 billion casualties. This represents a loss rate that should have resulted in complete social collapse within months. Instead, human resistance became more effective as their casualties increased. They did not fight a war to achieve victory. They fought a war to avoid defeat, and they continued fighting regardless of the cost. Delegate Morag of the Titanium Republic stood, her massive frame dominating her section of the chamber. Commander Zekai, you're suggesting that an entire species was willing to sacrifice itself rather than surrender? This defies every established principle of survival behavior. It does. And that is exactly what makes the human victory so significant. Zekai advanced the display to show detailed analysis of human psychological profiles developed during the conflict. Traditional warfare is based on the assumption that all species will eventually choose surrender when the cost of continued resistance exceeds the cost of submission. The humans appear to be neurologically incapable of making that calculation. Admiral Quex of the Stellar Navy, a being whose species had never lost a military campaign in recorded history, activated his speaking privileges. Commander, are you suggesting that humans are somehow immune to psychological pressure? No, admitted. I am suggesting that they respond to psychological pressure differently than any species we have previously encountered. When subjected to systematic demoralization, instead of becoming less willing to fight, humans become more determined to resist. Their psychological makeup appears to treat surrender as a more unpleasant option than death. The display showed comparative analyses of human and Drachmary psychological assessments throughout the conflict. Where Drachmary morale had steadily declined as the war prolonged, human determination had actually increased. Areas that suffered the highest casualty rates had produced the most effective resistance fighters. Populations that had endured the worst Drachmary psychological warfare had become the most committed to continued resistance. This data suggests that humans view warfare not as a means to achieve political objectives, but as an existential contest in which surrender represents a form of extinction worse than physical death. They sustained 7 years of total warfare, not because they believed they could win, but because they believed they could not afford to lose. Delegate Crixhan activated his speaking privileges again. Commander, even if we accept your analysis of human psychology, it does not explain how they defeated a technologically superior force with greater numbers and resources. It explains everything, Delegate. The Drachmary spent 7 years trying to break a species that could not be broken. Every tactic they employed to demoralize humans instead motivated them to become more effective fighters. Every casualty they inflicted created more resistance rather than less. Every month of occupation taught humans new ways to fight back rather than convincing them that resistance was futile. Zekai changed the display to show Drakmari strategic assessments from different phases of the conflict. The Drakmari never understood that they were not fighting a military force that could be defeated. They were fighting a species that had collectively decided that defeat was unacceptable regardless of the cost. The humans transformed their entire civilization into a weapon specifically designed to make conquest impossible. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of translated voices as delegates began debating among themselves. Chairman Veltar called for order, but it took several minutes before the session could continue. "Commander," Chairman Veltar said once order had been restored, "you are suggesting that the humans represent a completely new category of species, one that cannot be conquered through conventional military pressure." "I am suggesting more than that, Chairman. I am suggesting that the humans have demonstrated capabilities that challenge every assumption we have made about the limits of civilized endurance. They survived 7 years of conditions that would have destroyed any other species, and they emerged stronger rather than weaker." Admiral Quex activated his speaking privileges again. "What are the implications of this assessment for galactic security?" The question Zekai had been dreading. "The implications are significant, Admiral. If humans represent a new standard for resistance capability, then every military doctrine developed over the past millennium may be obsolete. More importantly, the humans are now aware of their own capabilities. They know that they can survive and fight under conditions that would break other species. Are you suggesting that humans represent a threat to galactic stability?" "I am suggesting that humans represent something unprecedented, a species that has transcended conventional limitations on military endurance. Whether that represents a threat or an opportunity depends on how the galactic community chooses to respond to their existence." Delegate Morag stood again. "Commander, what would happen if humans decided to expand beyond their current territory?" The question hung in the air like a toxic gas. Zekai had spent considerable time considering this possibility during his investigation, and his conclusions were not reassuring. "Based on my analysis of human capabilities, any species that attempted to resist human expansion would face the same problem that confronted the Drakmari. Humans appear to be capable of sustaining military operations indefinitely, regardless of casualties or setbacks. They do not fight wars to achieve quick victories. They fight wars to avoid defeat, and they will continue fighting until their enemies decide that victory is impossible." The chamber fell silent again. The implications of Zekai's assessment were beginning to penetrate the consciousness of delegates who had spent their entire careers operating under assumptions that humans had just proven wrong. Delegate Thuren activated her speaking privileges. "Commander, are you recommending any specific actions in response to your findings?" "I am recommending that the Galactic Council recognize that humans represent something new in galactic history. They are a species that has demonstrated the ability to fight under conditions that would destroy civilized society, and they have emerged from that experience with their civilization not only intact, but strengthened." Zekai paused, knowing that his next words would determine how the galaxy would respond to humanity for generations to come. "I recommend that the Council focus on integration rather than containment. Humans have proven that they cannot be conquered by conventional means. The only rational approach is to ensure that they have no reason to view other species as threats. Because if humans ever decide that the galactic community represents an existential danger to their species, the consequences would be beyond anything in recorded history." Admiral Quex leaned forward. "You believe humans could conquer the galaxy?" "I believe humans could fight the galaxy indefinitely. And based on what I have observed, indefinite warfare against humans would ultimately result in human victory. Not because they're stronger or smarter than other species, but because they're psychologically incapable of accepting defeat." The debate that followed lasted for hours, with delegates struggling to understand the implications of Zekai's assessment. Some argued that his conclusions were impossible, that no species could sustain the level of resistance he described. Others suggested that humans might be genetically modified or artificially enhanced in ways that explain their unusual capabilities. But as the session continued, the weight of evidence became overwhelming. The humans had survived 7 years of total warfare against a technologically superior enemy and had emerged victorious. They had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about the limits of civilized endurance. And, most importantly, they were now aware of what they could accomplish when pushed to their absolute limits. As the emergency session concluded, Chairman Veltar made the announcement that would reshape galactic politics for centuries to come. The Committee on Military Affairs hereby classifies the human species as a Category 1 existential consideration. All military planning and strategic assessments must henceforth account for human capabilities as demonstrated during the Drakmari conflict. The designation was unprecedented in galactic history. Category 1 existential consideration meant that humans were now classified as a species capable of threatening the continued existence of galactic civilization itself, not through aggressive expansion or superior technology, but through their demonstrated ability to fight indefinitely against any opposition. As delegates filed out of the chamber, many engaged in urgent conversations with their respective governments. The galaxy had just learned that it was sharing space with a species that had transcended conventional military limitations. The humans had proven that some civilizations were simply too stubborn to conquer, too determined to break, too committed to survival to ever accept defeat. And now the galaxy had to decide how to live with that knowledge. 6 months after the Galactic Council's emergency session, Zek-Hi found himself returning to Earth for what would be his final interview as part of the official investigation. The planet had continued its remarkable reconstruction efforts, transforming from a war-torn battlefield into something that resembled a functioning civilization, though one fundamentally different from what had existed before the Drakmari invasion. The changes were immediately apparent as a shuttle descended toward the surface. Cities were being rebuilt, but not according to their original plans. The new human settlements incorporated lessons learned during 7 years of underground warfare. Every building was designed to serve multiple functions. Every transportation system included hidden defensive capabilities. Every civilian installation could be rapidly converted to military use if necessary. Sarah Chan met him at the landing platform, but she was no longer the resistance coordinator he had first interviewed. She now held the position of Director of Planetary Security, a role that had no equivalent in previous human government structures. Her responsibilities included not just traditional military planning, but the coordination of what humans called civilization-scale defensive preparation. "Welcome back, Commander," she said as they walked toward the administrative complex that had been constructed over one of the former Resistance command centers. "I understand this will be your final report to the Council." "It will be. The committee has requested a comprehensive assessment of human capabilities and intentions moving forward. They want to understand what role humans might play in galactic affairs now that your species has been classified as a Category 1 existential consideration." Sarah's expression showed the same mixture of amusement and determination that Zek-Hi had noticed in all his interactions with humans. "That's quite a classification, Commander. Should we be flattered or concerned? That depends on what humans intend to do with the capabilities you demonstrated during the war." They entered a conference chamber that looked remarkably similar to the Resistance Command Center Zek-Hi had toured during his previous visit, except that the displays now showed reconstruction projects instead of military operations. The same systematic approach to organization was evident, the same methodical attention to detail, the same comprehensive planning that had characterized human resistance efforts. Marcus Webb and Dmitry Volkov were waiting for them, along with several other humans that Zek-Hi had not met before. Sarah introduced them as representatives of the various regional reconstruction authorities that had emerged from the former resistance networks. "Commander," Marcus began, Sarah mentioned that the Council is concerned about human intentions. "What specifically are they worried about?" "They're concerned about what happens when a species that has demonstrated your level of military capability begins to expand beyond their home system. The galaxy has never had to deal with a civilization that appears to be psychologically incapable of surrender." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the former head of the European Underground's medical services, leaned forward. "Commander, may I ask what the Council's experience has been with species that possess superior military capabilities? How do they typically behave once they achieve dominance in their region of space?" The question was clearly intended to make a point, and Zek-Hi recognized the tactical intelligence behind it. Most species that achieve significant military superiority eventually begin expanding their territory through conquest or coercion. This is considered a natural progression of civilizational development. And how successful are those expansion campaigns typically? Very successful, until they encounter another species with comparable capabilities. Most galactic conflicts are resolved when one side achieves clear military superiority. Dmitri spoke up. That's what makes our situation different, isn't it? We didn't win the war against the Drachmarie through superior military capability. We won because we were willing to fight longer than they were willing to occupy us. That is correct. Your victory was based on endurance rather than dominance. Sarah activated a holographic display that showed current human activities throughout the Sol system. Commander, I'd like to show you what humans are actually doing now that we've rebuilt our civilization. The display revealed a level of activity that surprised Zekhai. Human operations extended throughout the Sol system, with mining installations on asteroids, research stations around multiple planets, and manufacturing facilities that were producing goods at a scale that exceeded pre-war levels. But what was most remarkable was the nature of the production. We're not building weapons, Commander. We're building infrastructure, manufacturing systems, transportation networks, research facilities, educational institutions. Everything we learned about organization and resource management during the war, we're applying to reconstruction and development. Marcus manipulated the display to show detailed breakdowns of human production capabilities. During the war, we discovered that we were capable of much more than we had ever imagined. Not just in terms of military resistance, but in terms of organization, innovation, and cooperation. We learned that humans working together toward a common goal could accomplish things that seemed impossible. So we decided to find out what we could accomplish if that common goal was building something instead of destroying something. Dr. Vasquez added, Commander, the war changed us in ways that go beyond military capability. We discovered that we could sustain coordinated efforts involving our entire species for extended periods. We learned that we could adapt to conditions that would have destroyed our previous civilization. Most importantly, we learned that we could work together on a scale that we had never achieved before. Zekhai studied the production data, noting efficiency levels that exceeded anything in his experience. You are applying the same organizational methods you developed during the resistance to civilian reconstruction. We're applying the same determination, Sarah corrected. During the war, we discovered that humans are capable of incredible things when we're all working toward the same objective. The objective now is building the kind of civilization that can never be threatened the way we were threatened by the Drachmarie. And what would such a civilization look like? One that's strong enough to defend itself, but focused on creation rather than destruction. One that's capable of surviving any conceivable threat, but that uses those capabilities to explore, to build, to discover new things rather than to conquer other species. Elena brought up additional displays showing human research and development projects. Commander, we're applying the same intensity to scientific research that we applied to military resistance. We're developing technologies, exploring possibilities, pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. But our goals are completely different from what they were during the war. The war taught us that humans are capable of incredible endurance when we're fighting for survival, Marcus explained. Now we want to find out what we're capable of when we're fighting for growth instead of survival. Zekhai spent the next several hours reviewing human development projects, interviewing reconstruction coordinators, and observing the systematic approach that humans were applying to peacetime activities. What he discovered was both reassuring and unsettling. The humans were indeed focused on construction rather than conquest. Their resource allocation was heavily weighted toward research, education, and infrastructure development. They were not building military forces capable of offensive operations against other species. But they were building something potentially more significant, a civilization that incorporated all the lessons they had learned about organization, determination, and cooperation during 7 years of total warfare. Commander, Sarah said, as the formal interviews concluded, what will you tell the Council about human intentions? I will tell them that humans appear to be focused on development rather than expansion. But I will also tell them that you have created something unprecedented, a civilization that combines the organizational capabilities you developed during wartime with peacetime objectives. And what are the implications of that assessment? Zekhai considered the question carefully. The implications are that humans now represent something the galaxy has never encountered before. You are a species that has demonstrated the ability to function as a unified force when necessary, that can sustain coordinated efforts indefinitely, and that is proven capable of adapting to any conditions. But instead of using those capabilities for conquest, you appear to be using them for exploration and development. Is that a good thing or a bad thing from the Council's perspective? It is an unprecedented thing. The galaxy will need to develop new approaches to diplomacy and cooperation with a species that possesses your demonstrated capabilities, but does not appear interested in traditional forms of expansion or dominance. As Zekhai prepared to depart Earth for the final time, Sarah walked with him to the shuttle platform. The reconstruction efforts were visible in all directions, but so was something else. Humans working with the same intensity and coordination that had characterized their resistance efforts, but applied to entirely different objectives. "Commander," Sarah said as they reached the shuttle, "may I ask what you personally think will happen now? How will the galaxy adjust to having humans as neighbors?" Zekhai looked out over the bustling reconstruction activities, considering everything he had learned during his months of investigation. "Sarah, I think the galaxy will have to learn to coexist with a species that has transcended conventional limitations on what civilizations can accomplish. The question is not what humans will do to the galaxy, but what the galaxy will become with humans as participants." "Do you think that's a positive development?" "I think it is an inevitable development. Humans have demonstrated capabilities that change the fundamental nature of galactic politics. Other species will have to adapt to your existence, just as you adapted to Drakmari invasion. The difference is that humans are offering cooperation rather than conquest." As the shuttle lifted off and Earth fell away below them, Zekhai found himself contemplating the report he would submit to the Galactic Council. His conclusions would reshape galactic policy for generations to come, because he was not simply reporting on a military victory. He was reporting on the emergence of a new type of civilization. The humans had proven that some species could endure conditions that would destroy others, could organize on a scale that others could not achieve, could sustain efforts that others could not maintain. But instead of using those capabilities for traditional expansion, they were using them for purposes that the galaxy had never encountered before. His final report would recommend that the Galactic Council treat humans as partners rather than potential threats. Not because humans were not dangerous, but because their danger lay not in conquest, but in transformation. They had the potential to change what civilization itself meant on a galactic scale. But as Zekhai began composing his final analysis, he realized that he was still unsettled by one fundamental question. What would humans become when they eventually moved beyond the Sol system? They had demonstrated that they could survive and fight under impossible conditions. They had shown that they could organize their entire species toward common objectives. They had proven that they were psychologically incapable of accepting defeat. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when such a species decided to explore the stars. And Zekhai suspected that the answer would redefine what it meant to be a spacefaring civilization. His final conclusion was both reassuring and ominous. Humans represented the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge in galactic history. They could become the galaxy's greatest allies or its most persistent problem, depending on how other species chose to interact with them. But one thing was certain. The galaxy would never be the same, because it was now sharing space with a species that had learned exactly what they were capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. And the humans remembered every lesson they had learned during those 7 years when survival had required them to become something more than civilized.